There we go.
Hi, this is Aisha Hauser, and I'm the Director of Lifelong Learning at East Shore Unitarian Church in Bellevue, Washington. There's been a rise, even in liberal Seattle, of especially women in hijab and men of color being harassed. We have a huge immigrant population here in Seattle. And so I knew there were resources online. So what I did was I just researched what was online and put together kind of a training off the top of my head. And the first one I did actually was not, the first three I did were not in a UU church at all. The first one I did was at a center in Seattle and a community center. And then the next two were at a community college. And finally, just a couple of weeks ago, I did one here at East Shore. So I probably, in each one, probably between 50 and 70 people showed up. And what I realized is people need a place to talk through their anxiety and their fear. So I'm simply going to offer, and the links for the Google Docs are online. None of this is original. It is all curated, and I attribute where they came from on the documents. What I'm going to talk everyone through is, so for example, the outline of the training is the outline that I use. And what I'd like to do, and I think would be most helpful, is simply talk all of you through how to do this so that you can offer this in your settings. So the first thing, depending on where I am, is introductions. I just let people know who I am, because like I said, the first three, I was not at all in a UU setting. And then I open it up saying, what is a bystander? And so usually, obviously, people know, but we really talk through at that point, not only what is a bystander, but why do you think people don't act? Why do you think people don't respond to seeing somebody harassed? And then I also ask how many people here, by show of hands, have witnessed some kind of harassment? And unfortunately, every single workshop, there's quite a few people that raise their hand. And I've had people of color share stories. One woman, it was heartbreaking. She witnessed an interaction on a bus here in Seattle. And we talk through if people are comfortable. And I don't ever, mandate, obviously, anyone to share their story. Because one of the things I bring up is that we know that not only is there trauma inflicted on the person who's being harassed, there is some degree of trauma that people witnessing go through. Trauma may be a strong word depending on what the harassment looks like. And of course, everyone heard about what happened in Portland and the men who died, and trying to intervene with the man harassing the two girls. So, and so that's clearly traumatic for everyone who experienced it and witnessed it. So that's the first thing that I do. And then I facilitate that discussion depending on how much. Now I've offered this in 2-hour chunks, and each time I'm able to do it, even with 70 people, in the 2-hour time frame. So if you have less time, you could tweak that depending on your setting. So any questions on that? Do you want to type in the chat box? I'll just keep going. If anything jumps out at you, feel free to type in the question. So the next thing, I'm working with another computer. So then I go over the first handout, and that's the article that I thought was helpful, that was in the New York Times right after the election, how to help if someone's being harassed. So that's just a kind of a simple, clear article, but that I just invite people, because I like to have handouts, and people appreciate taking handouts home, or available for email. And like I said, I'm very clear, these do not come from me. So if you have come across blog posts or different kind of resources that you think would be more helpful, then certainly use those. These are just the ones that I used. So the first one is the New York Times article. The second one, the one that I actually use in terms of dialoguing about and tips, is the one from ihollerback.com. And well, actually, yeah, ihollerback. So this one has something called the 4 Ds. So I don't know if you all are looking at that, but that handout's also in the Google Doc. So the 4Ds: direct action, distract, delegate, and delay. So we go over each one. And since Portland, actually, and as soon as it happened, I thought about this. I actually am very much discouraging people from direct action. I think after the last workshop we did, and a lot of people brought up their families, and it was actually the bystander training I did was the night after the first Charlotte protest, the Friday night. So it was Saturday morning, and people talked about having these difficult conversations in their families. So for me, the direct action, direct intervention in public, I genuinely don't think is a good idea. And that's just me offering my opinion. And there's just a heightened sense of anxiety among people, fear. And so I don't feel comfortable telling people, this is the first thing that you do. I do feel comfortable saying, look, I think one of the things I said was, if I'm leading a youth group, or if I'm somewhere in a setting where I'm with folks either I know, so if it's a UU youth group, for example, or if I'm in coffee hour and I hear something that, I will make this assumption. It's unlikely really that people will be outright harassed in UU settings. It'll be more of a microaggression. And so a direct intervention or speaking up in reference to a microaggression is obviously different than outright harassment, but I talked a little bit in the context of that. The next one is talking about distract a person. So this is the one that we actually role played. So when we get to role play, I'll tell you what we did. But we talk about if you're in a position, for example, one of the videos online or cartoons have this scenario where a woman in a hijab is sitting on a park bench, and then a white man is just harassing her and saying terrible things. And so the scenario there is that a person, we did talk about gender in this case, because the person in the cartoon, in the scenario in the role play, is it's another female that will come and start talking to the person being harassed and ignoring the harasser. What time is it? Can you tell me where the nearest coffee shop is? What have you? So it was actually in the UU setting that this question came up. It didn't come up when we did it. Well, actually, it's not true. It did come up in the community setting, but one of the white men in the audience said, I don't know that I feel comfortable approaching, especially a Muslim woman in a hijab, if as a white male. And so I was really appreciative of that, because I said, yeah, you're right. I mean, for many reasons, and culture, being that culturally sensitive is important, and saying, you may not necessarily want to further raise the anxiety of the person. And so I didn't have an easy answer. I mean, to this gentleman, his wife was sitting right next to him, and I said, well, maybe if you're both together, your wife can be the one to go and say something. But so it is important to be mindful of the situation, and it doesn't mean not to act, but none of this is easy, and I don't have necessarily easy answers. Like I said, what I found best is simply talking this through. One of the time, so the last one I did, a woman said, a white woman, well, I think we can make the assumption that most people being harassed don't speak English. And of course, after twitching, I said, no, actually, that is not, it's not okay to make any assumption. However, if I was going to make an assumption, it would be more likely than not the person being harassed has been harassed before. This is not their first time being harassed. That's, if you're going to feel the need to make some kind of assumption, that's the one I would make. I would never make the assumption because someone looks differently, or maybe to you clearly an immigrant doesn't speak English. So it is helpful for us as the facilitators to gently redirect in a way that's helpful, so people can hopefully hear what you're saying and respect what you're saying. So have I tried role playing for these 4Ds? Yes, I actually found that I went from trying to find a role play for each one or making one up to, I just did 2. So what I have found with these role plays, people find them super helpful, and they do make people uncomfortable, which I guess is a good thing. Well, I'm fine with making people uncomfortable, obviously. However, I think I didn't share the role plays that I made up, because I think what might be good is just coming up with role plays that would be applicable in your area. So, and if you need ideas, I'd sure be happy to just send you. So one, for example, one scenario I did was I just replayed the one of the of the cartoon that I saw, or the graphic of a woman sitting on a bench, and then someone's harassing her, and then a third person comes and tries to just speaks to her. So that one we did was the distract one. The delegate one I've also done a role play for. So for example, the delegate one, we have our super chain here. One of them is called QFC. So person is clear, maybe has a turban on their head, or is a woman in a hijab, and they're just trying to do their job, and someone is just making snide comments to them. So the delegate one is, if you see something happening, depending where you are, go to a third party. So in that scenario, they role play that they come find a manager of the supermarket. And so I usually play the manager and come and intervene. And what people have reported each time, I've done this 4 times, is it was helpful seeing it and saying, oh, okay, this is what this would look like. So having an example, and I do ask for volunteers, and usually it takes a minute. Only actually at the college, it was the only place where people were jumping up to volunteer, and it was uncomfortable. I mean, one scenario, the person who was supposed to be the harasser just couldn't do it and just was super polite. It's because also we're in the Northwest, and so we had to recast that role play. The other one is delay. So delegate is the one where you get someone, maybe, like I said, in the scenario we used was a supermarket. If you're on a bus, maybe alerting the bus driver. So delay, if you see someone targeted with verbal harassment or something similar after it happens, asking them if they're okay. So delay is the one that people felt the most empowered to do. And many people after each time said, that's the one I could do. I didn't know that would be so important. So one of our church members at the most recent training I did told a story of Christmas time, just this last December after the election. A white man started really just harassing a woman who appeared to be Chinese. And so he just was saying things to her and was awful. And this was in Macy's. So maybe it was, one of the malls in the area. And so this older white woman, she said, the man walked away, and she said, I just turned to this woman and said, I am really sorry that happened. Basically that was awful. And I'm sorry. And the woman, she said, she just walked away, like she was full and didn't, wasn't going to process with this white woman. But what happened was, when she went to pay for her clothes, it was another woman of Asian descent who was working there, and she turned to this person and said, thank you so much for saying that. And so by acknowledging the harm that was caused, even if that person walked away and didn't get justice, for example, saying something even after will send a message to the people around you. Because one of the things that's been most distressing is not only when people don't act right when it's happening, sometimes it does happen too fast. Sometimes it's a snide remark and it's people being rude and then they go away. But even afterwards, take the opportunity to say, hey, I'm really, really sorry that happened. That it is acknowledge that was inappropriate. It was mean, and let that person know that you care about their well-being. So advice on intervening when a person of color is a bystander in a racial harassment. So actually I've been making, I said not to make assumptions, but I've been making the assumption that these are almost all people of color that have been harassed. That's been the experience here in the Seattle area. Oh, I'm sorry, bystander. Yeah, so that's a good question. And I would say the same things apply, because ultimately how an intervention happens will depend on the person's comfort level. And so we'll get later to talking about authorities and police and such. So for me, I am more likely actually to try to comfort the person after, or delegate depending on where we are. And so I do think there's value in still saying something if you're comfortable. And I could understand if definitely if a person of color isn't. And so, and the difficult thing about all of this, it's all a case by case, and depending on the person's comfort level. And I have found, like I said, there's been value in simply talking this through and asking the room and getting the wisdom of where you are, of what other people have done and what other experiences people have had. Back to delegation. What if the person you seek out doesn't know what to do or isn't willing to intervene? Oh, okay. So in case of, all right. So let's say you're in the supermarket and then it's so interesting. I always get questions I've never gotten before. I don't know in that case. I mean, I guess the role plays I've done, I've just decided that the person is going to do the right thing and get that person to safety. Then, okay, so let's follow that through. So let's say you go to the manager at the supermarket. The manager just, for whatever reason, is racist themselves and terrible, doesn't do anything. You could still maybe do the distract one and maybe start asking the person questions even as they're working, and just say, oh, you know what, I thought this was on sale, and maybe it wasn't on sale, or whatever. Maybe just try to ignore the person harassing and engage the cashier. I mean, in this instance, it's a cashier, in conversation. I mean, maybe distract in that scenario is maybe the best way to go. Yeah, combining strategies, exactly. So that might be the way to go. And when I've done this and people have asked me a question that I've kind of, maybe I didn't know the answer to, I always open it up and say, well, does anyone have ideas or feedback, or have you witnessed this? Has this happened? And, even talking through, it's been helpful for folks, because folks who self-select to come to a bystander training are motivated to want to help, right? I realize that, just the difficulty we're all in right now. And so I found really some really helpful wisdom in the room. So I hope that was helpful. So those are the 4 Ds. So then I go into role plays. So I actually, even though I've had, even the largest group, I've had 70 people, because what I was had thought about when I first put this together was maybe breaking folks up into small groups and then having them role play with each other. But I actually found, I didn't find that necessary. I found that the entire group sees the role play together and then processes. Now, you may want to have people process in small groups, certainly after maybe they watch it, or together. It'll depend on, if you have over 100 people, you're going to want them to process in small groups, and then just raise their hand if they have questions for you. Okay, so then I have process role plays, process with a discussion about being an active bystander. So what is an experience you have had speaking up for someone who's being harassed? That is always powerful, because there's always at least 1 or 2 stories of people who will talk about when they've witnessed something. And actually only once I did have a person of color share when they were harassed. And I never, ever, ever, ever had the expectation that a person of color needs to talk about that in a group or relive anything like that. Gabrielle, I'll get to that question in 1 second. The other one is, what is a time you could have intervened but didn't? Do you think you would act differently now? So these, and you could come up with other questions that you think would be helpful. And then what are some other things bystanders can do to help intervene, brace, normalist? Okay, so Gabrielle Farrell's asking, does bystander training apply to events such as protests in Charlottesville? My short answer is no. I would be really irresponsible to conflate or confuse this kind of workshop with actual activism workshops. And so those, like folks like Didi Delgado or Leslie Mack or Black Lives Matter, any of the local chapters, are the places to go for training. And well, Christina Rivera is on this call, and maybe Christina, I'd love to invite you, if you want to talk about what kind of strategies and tactics you use. But this is not that. This is just simply for kind of everyday type things. It's for folks who, aren't self-selecting to go to a march, or aren't, putting them, for many valid reasons, aren't going to protest in that way. Or however, that the activism that they want to take part in is, I don't want to be a bystander. I don't want to be someone who doesn't say something. Okay, I don't know anyway, so Chris, that's what I would say, that, definitely there are workshops, and I would say definitely get in touch with Black Lives Matter, or I don't know if Southern Poverty Law Center does that type of training, but I know Black Lives Matter does. What if you are the person being harassed? I know this would technically not be a bystander training. Yeah.
Aisha, I'm going to give you a second to think about that, because Christina said she would be willing to speak to.
Great. Let's have Christina on, and then we'll go back to that. Good. Great.
Hey, everybody. So what I would say is, it is different from bystander training for protests, or even, nonviolent action training. So when you're going to a protest, if you're doing direct action, there's very specific training that is given for that, and that has a lot to do with police action and what you're doing collectively, right? The bystander training that Aisha's talking about right now is what to do when you're an individual, generally, in individual situations in your everyday life. Bystander training, there is bystander trainings for protests and direct actions, but that is a bystander who is there to provide support in a different way. So that bystander may be trying to redirect people away from the folks who have decided to do the direct action. So they may have different, very specified roles in that direct action and for that particular day. So that's how it's a little bit different than what Aisha's going over today.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I definitely do not want to in any way give the impression that this would be helpful at all at something like counter protests. And so thank you for that, Christina. The other, before I get to talking about police or not, so the other resource that I added is just kind of worksheet type things. If you did want to break folks into groups, it's kind of a resource to say, here's a worksheet, talk about if someone gave you these excuses for not intervening, what would you say? Kind of to give people an opportunity to brainstorm. If someone says, well, it's not my problem, or nobody else is doing anything, or it's harmless and I can't make a difference. So people then can start having the discussion about how they would respond to some of this. And maybe, people have heard some of that. And another worksheet that I suggest is just for folks, actually, no, I'm going to take that back. These are from also I Holler Back, but give an example of the 4Ds. And again, one of why I even wanted to offer this to all of you is every time I do one of these, I have 3 or 4 people ask me to do more. And I said, if more people, especially religious educators and ministers, made space in whether it's in our congregations or your local community centers, to have folks who aren't wanting to take part in the kind of activism of direct action in that way. This is a form of activism that people can at least be empowered to do, because this is happening 24 hours a day everywhere. So having the space for people to talk has been, I think, what I've witnessed has been helpful. That's what people have reported to me. It's super helpful. So from a RRUUC member. I went to ACLU bystander training in DC before the Women's March, and it was very similar to what you've presented so far. Distraction works, we are told, particularly for marcher who was alone. Okay, great. I just didn't want to misrepresent what I'm doing. So if this, you know, is presented other places in different ways, then great. But I guess, again, what I'm hoping that you all take from this, and feel free to email me or contact me on the Religious Educator page on Facebook, is that we make space for people to come together and talk this through. Because one of the things I found is just there is a heightened sense of anxiety. One of the things that happened when I did this at the community college is I did make reference to the reason for this heightened sense of anxiety is our current president. And so afterwards, and I thought I was being careful, but my bar for careful is different than everyone else's. So this woman comes up to me after and she said, you know, it's really important that you realize that there are people who voted for Trump who are here. And I said, you know, I wish you had actually brought that up in front of everyone, because it is important to talk about. Sure, I'm sure some of these people in this room voted for the current president. And it's important not to be neutral in situations where people are being harmed, and that's true nationally. And so I'm not, when I come into these, especially when I'm not in a UU setting, I let folks know I'm not neutral. Right, when we are neutral in the face of oppression, we've chosen the side of the oppressor. So I'm unapologetic about that, and I got invited back to the college. That person said something, so they weren't that mad, I guess, or we're in the conflict avoidant Northwest, so maybe people didn't make too much of it. I'm not sure, but so, okay. Reporting harassment. I do encourage people strongly to either go on the Southern Poverty Law Center website or the ACLU, or if there is anonymous reporting, so that there is a bearing of witness. Southern Poverty Law Center, I think, does, I don't want to say the best, but I know that they're soliciting and wanting to document hate crimes on the rise. So I do encourage people to do that. Now, while researching for this material, there are places, and even the video that, thank you to Susan Lawrence for sending that video to me about bystander training tips. And in that video, the person says clearly, do not call police. Unless the person asks, do not call the police. And so, so I totally get that. And so, and I also know that, for example, here in Bellevue, we've had our Black Lives Matter sign on the church vandalized now. I think we're up to 5 or 6 times. And the police here have bent over backwards to try to be supportive of us and help. And so here in Bellevue, I would feel comfortable calling the actual police officer I know, but in Seattle, I wouldn't. The Seattle police, I don't feel that comfortable at all, but so thank you, Chris. Christopher put up the video I'm talking about. And the thing that struck me, that the advice in that video that I do think is absolutely true, unless the person being harassed asks you, don't call the police. And so that is the one that I would absolutely affirm, unless the person who's being harassed, because you also don't know their immigration status at all. And so, so that's for a lot of reasons, obviously, right? So that I thought was very sound advice. Now, having said that, if someone's running around with a weapon, and I mean, hopefully that will not, no one will be witness to that. But if it is a harassment situation and the person doesn't ask for anyone to call the police, don't. And I have encouraged folks to report the harassment online. That's what I do. That's the program that I have presented to folks. So let me know if you have any questions. And the last thing I have here is questions. So what has come up for you? Does this make sense? Does this not make sense? And is this helpful? So feel free to jump on the chat box and let me know if you all have any questions. No?
This might also be a point where you could actually just unmute if you wanted to ask a question rather than type it.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. No? Oh, you're welcome. Said it was helpful. So one of the things I would suggest doing in terms of practically implementing this, go through either what happened here, how I ended up at even a community center is one of our members here at East Shore Unitarian Church is on the board of a community center in Seattle, and she asked me to do it. And I went and presented it. You can also, when we had it at the church, we actually had quite a few members from other UU churches attend, which was really cool. So just have one at your congregation. Do I have a link to the cartoon? It's actually, if you Google it, I think it was a French person. I'll try to find it. I'll try to find it. Suggested role plays. So I basically literally just made them up. So based on things people have said, or so here's how I got the supermarket one. There was somebody in this congregation who was purchasing Everclear alcohol at a liquor store to make vanilla during Christmas. So the cashier, she said it looked like he was a man who was a Sikh. He had a turban. And so the white man in front of her said something, or maybe he was behind her. He said something like, "They're everywhere, aren't they?" And so she turned to him and she said, "Yeah, human beings are everywhere, aren't they?" And she just shut him down, and he kind of made a face, and she said he must have made assumptions about me because I'm a white woman buying a lot of alcohol. But for whatever reason, he thought she was going to agree with him. But I used a version of that for a role play. So I would say you can Google some or just kind of make up role plays that based on incidents either you've witnessed or you've heard others talk about. Ideas of how to take this to, oh, thank you, Chris. Chris found the cartoon. You're like amazing. Chris is Step Up is really good. So I think the way to take this to high school, this is interesting because I think you could do this. You could do this exact thing with youth. And I think with youth, it would be important to really be mindful that you are dealing with minors and you don't want them to put themselves in danger, especially if you have youth of color in your youth groups. Because as Mark Morrison Reed said, the advice and empowerment that we advocate with our white youth will get our youth of color killed. And so we do want to be mindful of who is in your youth group and maybe acknowledging that reality that we don't want to be bystanders. And maybe the focus for youth would be to make sure that they, maybe do the delay one, is that after something happens that they let the person know that they support them and they're sorry that this happened. So it depends on your youth group. It depends on, I think, where you are. I have found that white fragility plays out in youth group the way it does with adults. And so I would just say be mindful of that. And sometimes a unrealistic sense of how they can fix the situation. So it could, definitely you could do this with youth group, but yeah, someone put up a resource on how to do Step Up, I think. So how to publicize this. Now for us, we have a strong social justice network among all the congregations. So so the folks who are connected through Climate Action or the Native American social justice groups, they have an email list, and so they put this on that email list, and then that's what happened. And so we had a lot of people attend. And what I've had, and it's happened already, like after the last one, someone who lives in the city of Shoreline called and said, "Hey, can you do this for the city? I'm going to take this to the city, I guess, council or whatever." And so I would just advertise it, and maybe if there's a community bulletin board, or maybe if you have a community center online, you can, and if you aren't near a lot of other UU congregations, you can invite folks from other congregations to come. Vanessa Southern said at a training last week that Layman led, he gave the example of the woman in hijab having it ripped off her head, wow, in a Southwest flight. I think I have the details, yeah, and how she was thrown off the flight. What would our strategy be then? Distraction doesn't seem right. The delegated leaders are the ones who decided to ask her off the plane. No, I didn't answer anything like this. This is where, so One of the things I would suggest is taking your cameras out and recording an incident like that. Social media in this case has been really powerful getting people to pay attention. And it's unfortunate because it's the only way that people have been paying attention to what's been happening with police and with harassment. So in that case, yeah, I don't have a good answer except to say that's when we can really advocate for boycotting Southwest and, you know, doing a kind of a social media advocacy to bring attention to really unfortunate. And that's where I would say use the power of clergy is, you know, have the UUMA send a statement to Southwest. I mean, I think we need to use our voice. I mean, it was so heartening in Charlottesville to see how many of those clergy were Unitarian Universalists that were there. And I mean, not just ordained and lay clergy, that were arm in arm and out there and being visible. So this is something where I would say, whip out your camera. And I said that actually, someone had asked recently about if you see police mistreating, maybe they're in an arrest or they're in the process of an arrest, or you think they're not being respectful to someone, especially if it's a boy of color, man of color, person of color, take out your phone. You know, I said, don't interfere with an armed police officer. That's not going to end well for anyone. And so I just tell people, take out your phone and start recording it. So that's not the best answer. Anyone else have ideas for that? Feel free to unmute. No. We're having Les Manois in East Shore in October, so that'll be interesting. Okay. I think I got to, I don't know if I missed any questions because they kind of came really quickly. There's one new message. Nope, I don't see any. Okay. There is I don't know if anyone saw, scroll to see Leslie's link to Step Up, where you can find more information, program intended for college students, so that's helpful. And maybe on the Religious Education Facebook page, we can share resources that we find, because you can use whatever is helpful in your setting. These aren't mine. I just curated, like I said, I tried to get something that was clear and easy for folks to remember. And I genuinely found that people just needed to talk through their anxiety and their fear. So I don't know if I answered everyone. If I didn't answer your question, feel free to type it again. You're welcome, everybody. Thank you for showing up. Okay, I think we're good. I don't have anything else. Thank you all so much. And if there's nothing else, this will be recorded, right? You're welcome, Pat. Christopher, this is recorded, right?
It is. We missed the first about 10 seconds, so I'm going to get you to introduce yourself again after everybody else is gone.
Okay, great. All right, so I'll stay on while everyone, and then this will be online if folks who didn't get to see it can watch it. So you're welcome. Thank you all.